Okay, my name is Dana Bryan Stewart, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit about gunfighters in the Old West because of all the different eras of weapons and warfare. That pretty much holds the imagination more than anything, and there's a reason for that. The gunfighters of the Old West, they have a certain aura, a certain coolness to the way they dressed and everything. But really, for me, what got me going about gunfighters and what held my attention was the fact that my great-great-grandfather was apparently pretty good with a pistol. We went out to Comanche County, Texas, to see where he was buried, James Calvin Stewart, and he was born in 1852, and they said that in 1872, so he was only about 20 years old, he was a deputy sheriff. And when we went out to visit the gravesite, this old cowboy-looking guy wandered out and said, you know, your great-great-grandpappy was pretty well known with a pistol. And when guys like John Wesley Hardin would come into town, they'd look up your ancestor, and they'd take down their pistols and go have a drink with him out of respect for him. And when I looked in our family tree, I found out that he had named one of his kids, John Wesley, another one, Clay Allison. He'd named several kids after famous gunfighters of the era, and so there must have been some truth to that statement. Now, here's the deal about gunfighters. When we think of gunfighters in those days, we think of a guy with a pistol, something like this, and people were scared to death of him because in a lightning-quick maneuver, he could pull out that pistol and boom, you were dead. And so when a gunfighter would walk through town, people knew that he had that deadly accuracy, that deadly quickness. But here's the thing. What people aren't aware of is that the modern pistol, with its bullets that you drop into a chamber and all that, was not where the gunfighter era started. Because before John Wesley Hardin, there was a guy named Wild Bill Hickok. And Wild Bill Hickok actually did not wear a gun belt. He wore a red sash around his waist, and he was called the Prince of Pistoliers. He was incredibly fast. What he did was he took his guns and worked on them himself to where really the trigger was not even used. All he had to do was wave his thumb over that hammer, and when the spring released the hammer back, it was enough to make the gun go off. And he was incredibly fast because he could just fan his thumb over the top of that hammer, the gun would go off, and boom. Plus, he was known to be deadly accurate. They say that he could put he was like a Texas Ranger. He could put, something like 8 out of 10 bullets into a playing card from the back of a horse that was going by, at a full gallop. So those guys really did practice. Another thing they had to do, too, guys like Hickok, was they didn't have bullets. They had a roll-your-own type of bullet where they had a cap and a ball, and they had to put them together, and they could misfire all the time, and then they would release all this smoke into the room. And being able to shoot in the middle of that eye-burning smoke alone was a skill. So there was a lot of things that went on in those days that we don't think about now. We think of the gunfighter with his little leather harness rig and a pistol with a wheelhouse. But really, I'm fascinated with all the things that go into making that gunfighter, all the men that went before then. Men, hold on a second, who had something, let's say, that looked remotely like this, going back to, let's say, the pirates, or more recently, even the mountaineers. The mountain men had pistols like this jammed about their person, and before then, the pirates. Before then, the Highlanders, the Scotsmen, which, being a Stuart, I know a bit about them. With the Highlanders, they'd come doing what they called the Highland Charge. They'd come running down the hill using the battlefield as an advantage with the sun behind them, coming downhill. They'd have their giant claymore swords. They'd have smaller swords. They'd have pistols, which I guess you could call a pistol, something like this, jammed about their person. But in those days, the gun only fired once. And you were a rich man if you had one, let alone two. And what the Highlanders would do, the ones who were more well equipped, is they would run down the hill and they would shoot real close with one of their pistols and then maybe their other, and then they'd actually throw them and use them as a weapon that way. And then they'd pull out their swords and finally their knives. So weapons really grew up a lot over the years. When you hear about the pirates and how the pirates fought, one of the things they did, much like the Highlanders, is they used the battlefield to their advantage. And a lot of warfare is the mind. Really, that's where you get the supreme advantage. The pirates would come to battle and they would have knives and pistols and swords all throughout their body. And when they said armed to the teeth, they really were. They would have an extra dagger in between their teeth when they came down the rigging on a ship. William Teach, who we know as Blackbeard, had a big flowing beard, and he used to take the little bits of frizzen that they used. It's like a small fuse that they used to use for their early pistols. He would take those and tie those into his beard and light them on fire, and it would scare the living daylights out of anyone who saw him coming with all those weapons and the little things burning in his beard and his eyes glowing wild. You can imagine. So what I've found is, although it was the gunfighters that got me into weapons, really it's the psychological aspects and the aura of the gunfighter themselves that goes back many hundreds, even many thousands of years that fascinates me, because the weapon is the tool, but it's the mind that drives it. It is the taking advantage of the other person's fear that made the gunfighter, the pirate, the Highlander, even the Vikings, going back even further, all the way to when the Scots fought against the Romans, and the Romans ended up being so afraid of them they built Hadrian's Wall. It was the willingness to fight and the terror that it instilled in the Romans when the Scots came to battle all painted up, completely naked, all painted up in wild colors. That struck terror into the hearts of the Romans themselves, the conquerors of the whole world at that time, to where they finally just gave up and built a wall across the entire island of England, separating England from Scotland. And they said, well, they're a warlike people, and when not at war, they fight amongst themselves. Let's just let them be. So when you look at warfare, you look at weapons, you look at gunfighters, which got me originally interested, it's the mind that drives it that really is the most fascinating weapon of all, isn't it? That's what scares people.